straight into a champions. So I set up with an infantry, spear, and bow team. Miranda as my lord. The idea was to keep as many stats in each team as possible. We went with a 3-way split, with me in the center, going straight for the choke point. As you can see here, a team on the right, or a reasonable number of people, didn't stick with their leader and went straight for an outpost, which wasn't the direction. This really hurt the numbers on the right hand side. They were really deficient compared to what they were going up against, and so they had a really hard time. Eventually they had to fall back to the right side outpost. You can see here that the enemy just outnumbered them and pushed them off the objective. So if I'd had the full numbers in the centre, which I still didn't, then I would have liked to have gone for both the west and east outpost on their side of the map. This hopefully would have drawn some of the enemy from the 2 key strategic objectives back towards their outpost, and even if it didn't, we could have pushed forward and flanked them on both sides. Now I made the call instead of that to go back to WF, as there was only 3 minutes left before the first respawn. I think that was a mistake on my part. I probably should have pushed forward on the right hand side and just asked for a couple of members to go back to WF. We got there with plenty of time in the end, and also the enemy didn't have a significant force there, so we really could have just nabbed a quick resource and got it over to the objective. So we opted to move to the southeast outpost, which again, I think maybe we could have gone to the north and gained some space or pushed them back a little, as well as picking up a building and a resource at the same time. We probably had the numbers at that point, which we didn't later, so we should have taken advantage. But these things are things we're going to learn on the fly and on the go, of course. But it's really interesting to look over the footage after the fact. I think even if you're not making a video, it's probably not a bad idea to actually record matches, so you can review them yourself and sort of assess what you could have done differently. So by this point, all of our teams were deficient on numbers. I think people had been distracted by objectives because they had so many. They felt the need to grab some back and took the initiative to do so, which isn't a bad thing where it was possible to do, but it meant each of the main forces was just slowly diminishing in numbers, as well as them not having enough people necessarily to take the objective that they thought they might be able to pick up cheaply. Along with that, a lot of people were having some real issues in game. I try and be reasonably positive, but it did hurt us a bit. So the enemy picked up the third resource. We were in the lead at this point, which didn't happen very often throughout the game. But I believe if we had, at this point, focused on Winterfell directly, then we probably could have maintained it. They didn't have the numbers in the centre yet to hold on to that resource, so we eventually end up picking it back up. Rather than focusing the defenders, as you can see here, I'm running them around a little bit, allowing my guys to put some damage on, but mainly letting the resource carrier separate himself from the main force, and therefore letting us target him easier. So once he's been targeted, he goes down fairly quickly. We can pick up the objective, Mega grabs it here and starts moving southwest, or southeast, sorry. And again, this is where we probably should have pushed north. It would have meant that it would have been harder for them to fight back to Winterfell, and we would have picked up one of the objectives that we probably really needed at this point. We're only just ahead, so the points were adding up against us. This is the next issue. I've heard since that if you hover over a team that's stuck on the mountains and hit R, you may be able to free them and get them back to base. I tried several different things, nothing seemed to work, but I can't honestly say that I did that. It is disappointing though that you need to know a workaround for something that should be fairly straightforward. You know, I was basically from the 33-minute mark, I was down to 2 marches. Being that we were already outnumbered, that wasn't a great thing. especially considering I'm fairly high up on the rally leader list, so stats wise that team would have been appreciated. By this stage Titus had picked up the resource and we moved it to the southwest. Again, I would maybe have chosen to go a different way, but in this case we didn't have the southwest anyway, and it illustrates really why you don't need to go to your own objective when you're carrying the resource. We sent a smaller group ahead to take the objective while another force protected the resource carrier. We had more than enough time, with the resource carrier being so slow and the fact that there wasn't that much defense on any of the objectives really. It was an easy lock, so we picked up both the resource points and the objective itself. Once again, the troops were stuck on the wall and not going anywhere. I tried to restart at this point, which illustrates, the disruption it can cause. Not only were you a march down, but then you're trying to fix the situation as you play, and it's just really not helpful. We had consolidated a reasonable amount by this point, but so had the enemy. And it basically turned at this point where they weren't that much ahead, but due to our troops spreading out too far and their troops really consolidating on the centre, they just had the numbers advantage and used it to good effect. Every time somebody dies and has to go back to base, it's a fair amount of time before they get back into the action. So they were able to push forward. As you can see here, their left side did a fairly good job of getting ahead and then chasing us back a bit further. Of course, you don't want to stand and fight overwhelming numbers, but once that starts happening, you really need reinforcements to get there and turn the tide of the battle pretty quickly. Unfortunately, in this mode, obviously it takes time to get anywhere, so while you are able to move around, you really need to be in the right place from the beginning, and that's where having those leaders and sticking with the leaders is really important. So we regrouped, and from there we had a reasonable force, which was easy enough to take any of the objectives that we aimed for. We took the southeast and then the northeast, and we were going to work towards the resource carrier, which was hiding out in the northwest. This is a tactic that I've seen employed before, and it works pretty well in the right situation. So considering they had the points on us already, they didn't need to worry too much about getting the resources. They had more objectives, or, were able to get more objectives fairly easily, and they had a lead already. By delaying the resource, it meant that we couldn't pick up any additional resources, which may have swung the points to our favour. They did eventually get forced to deposit that resource, but by that stage they'd really run down the clock, and that really cost us, because there just wasn't enough time for us to get another resource or two to make up the difference required. And by this stage, even if there was enough time, as you can see here, their numbers were just overwhelming, and they'd secured WF so effectively that the forces that we had, which were arriving in small groups and in dribs and drabs, weren't ever going to push them off the objective, which again just highlights the importance of staying within your groups. There's no sense in fighting large numbers as a solo troop. You will get beaten down while you're attacking one. There's multiple enemies attacking you, and they're all the while getting pincer bonus, which makes a reasonable difference in any fight. So even for stronger opponents, if you've got the numbers surrounding them and just laying on the damage, they will go down eventually. I mean, my Lord team stays up fairly well throughout this match, but you can see when it does get pinned down by, 6, 7, 8 enemies, it's still taking a fair amount of damage. If I didn't have Annie on the team, it would have taken a lot less to put it down, which again highlights how important Annies are in this whole mode. I don't think they can be discounted at all. I even went as far as to hiring a gold Annie this time, which I hadn't done previously. Seems like a little bit of a waste at the end of the day, but what can you do? Anyway guys, cheers for coming along. Hope you found it at least a little bit informative as to what not to do, and paid attention to some of the key points. Stick together, stay with your leaders and communicate, and don't get distracted.